This is part one of the lecture of Pure Populism, Juan Perón of Argentina. And I mentioned before that many people, and I include myself in this, see Perón as the best example, the most obvious example of how populism operated in Latin America. So let's just return to defining capitalism a little bit and look at its background, because Argentina provides a really great example of where this populism came from. I'm arguing that it was a real logical consequence of how Latin American capitalism had developed, that we had the growth of export sectors. If you think back to the lecture on Brazil with the rise of the textile industry out of coffee, we have some industrialization coming out of urbanization, but the growth of the big cities is really because of the success of export agriculture. And we know from previous lectures that in many countries, workers and some middle-class groups sought more political power. And new leaders, these populist leaders, rise to prominence by bringing these new actors into politics because they want to use them to transform things. But it's also all happening in the aftermath of the Great Depression. The Depression took all of the problems that we saw with the limited nature of politics, the rise of this new working class, the rise of middle class, and it made it worse. The crash in commodity prices put the political system in crisis. The political systems and the economies both crashed as well. And populism, it's important to understand, was not a revolution. It was not fundamental change. It was simply an attempt to mediate among the social classes without changing the class structure. And that's what really makes it not revolutionary. Now, at the time, in the middle of it, many of the opponents of populists thought they were revolutionary. Many of the followers of populists thought they were revolutionary. But really, in the final analysis, they're not. They're just trying to make things better within the existing framework. And then the question becomes, is that framework sustainable in the long term? But during the heyday of populism, people thought it was. They thought they could use the state to mediate the social and economic conflicts inherent in this kind of capitalist development. But as I've repeated several times, it was not and is not revolutionary. It's attempting to fix the status quo by changing distribution without necessarily changing ownership. It relied on the controlled mobilization of new actors through the state. And we saw that a little bit with Cardenas with the agrarian reform and how he dealt with nationalizations to end strikes. In the case of Argentina, it's very much urban labor. And Perón, as Cardenas had, uses a corporatist system to mediate all of these things. So, who was Perón? Where did he come from? What did he do? He was a military man, and he rose to power indirectly. We'll explain this in a second. In a coup. There he is, Juan Domingo Perón, with his wife, Evita, and he was president of Argentina from 1946 through 1955, and then briefly again in 1973. And Evita's popularity was unbelievably important for his political prominence. So I said he sort of came to power in a coup. What happened was in 1943, there was a military coup of colonels, in other words, powerful military men, but not the leadership, not the generals. And they were in a group called the Grupo de Oficiales Unidos. And they overthrew the Concordancia because they said the Concordancia was a sellout basically to the British. They said, all we do in the 1930s, all we've done was sell our wheat and beef to the British, and this has made the landowners rich, but it's basically denationalized Argentina. They were rising, highly nationalistic officers who thought that the government and the ruling elite were ignoring national development, all in order to promote the export sector. And they felt that foreign interests were altogether too powerful. They also worried very much that social conflict could devolve into civil war. Several of these officers had been military attachés in Europe, some even in Spain, and they witnessed firsthand the Spanish Civil War. And they worried very, very much that if the state just let the market do everything and the market was just tied to the British, that things would spiral out of control, that there needed to be some state role in the society. Well, Perón was not one of the leaders of this coup, but he was involved in it. And as a reward to him, he got kind of a cruddy reward. He was made the Minister of Labor. The reason it's a cruddy reward is that the Minister of Labor had very, very little power. But Perón was extremely ambitious, and he immediately decided to expand his portfolio. He encouraged unionization, and he wanted this all through the Ministry of Labor, which he controlled. And there were lots of new workers, the children of immigrants, migrants from the countryside, in some new industries like textiles and food processing and hat making and this sort of thing, where there were not anarchists and there were not radicals. There were kind of people without politics. And he did this to consolidate his power. And what he did was he lionized these people. He held them up as the great hope and future of Argentina. And he called them the shirtless one, los descamisados. Now, they had shirts. What this was referring to was that they didn't have formal white-collared shirts, expensive laundered shirts that not just elites, but members of the old UCR, the radical party, would have. So this is not middle class. It's against the middle class. It's against the elite. It's a focus on these newer workers in newer industries, people who were newer to Buenos Aires, who had migrated from the countryside, who hadn't had any experience with organized labor, because these new industries were not tied up with the existing political groups. Now, he was so successful that his fellow colonels had had enough, and they put him in jail. They thought he had ignored their orders. He'd really pushed for political power, and this alienated people. So they put him in jail in October of 1945. But his wife organized massive protests. His wife, Eva Duarte de Perón. She organized such big protests that he forced the hand of the other men, and he was released from jail. And upon his release, just a few weeks after being jailed in late 1945, he immediately became the leading candidate in the upcoming presidential elections. He was the one with the most name recognition and the most support. And we can't ever discount how big a political asset Eva was known as Evita, was. She had been from the rural sector. She was one of these people who migrated to to Buenos Aires, and she became an actress, a radio actress, and she really understood modern communications media, modern audiences, and how to appeal to them. She was incredibly popular. You can see here speaking to a huge rally of women. Women had not been involved in politics before the Peróns came up, and they didn't quite have the right to vote. You'll see in the second half of the lecture, that's one of the things that Perón does. But Evita mobilizes women very, very well. And so in the presidential campaign, Perón demonized the landed elite. So there were sellouts to the foreign sector. And he had the support of many workers, some enlisted men, and even some industrialists, because what he started to do was separate out the elite between the rural elite and the urban elite. And he said that he was going to help promote some industry. He also wanted to use the rural sector to provide inexpensive food for the working class. Now, if workers in Latin America do not make a lot of money, and a vast portion of their income goes to housing, food, and transportation. So if you can decrease their food prices, you're giving them a de facto raise without costing their bosses any money. So that's a way that he helps both labor and the industrialists by making the cost of living cheaper for the workers at the expense of the rural elite. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the second half of the election. So who were his opponents? Well, the landed elite didn't like him because they were going to have to sell their food at cheaper price. Middle class groups tied to the export economy, the radical party people, they didn't like him. The socialist and communist parties, which weren't very big, but they didn't like him because they saw him as a threat because he was mobilizing among the working class. And the U.S. government certainly thought that he was way too nationalistic. In fact, the U.S. ambassador was a man named Sproul Braden. And he was so publicly against Perón's election that Perón used that to his advantage and simply plastered all over Argentina big placards that read Braden or Perón, Braden or Perón. Do you want to vote for the pro-U.S. people? Braden wasn't on the ballot. He was U.S. ambassador. But I'm not even going to put that guy's name there. And that kind of nationalism and that kind of challenging of the old radical party and challenging of the rural elite was very effective, and Perón won in a landslide.